nothing but progress. The political rebirth that occurred in the West is likewise impressive, especially the rehabilitation of Germany, which transformed itself from a pariah nation to a responsible member of the European family in just a few short years. A new desire for international cooperation was also born during the post-war years, which would bring not only prosperity but peace. The decades since 1945 have been hailed as the single longest period of international peace in Europe since the time of the Roman Empire. It is little wonder that those who write about the post-war era, historians, statesmen, and economists alike, often portray it as a time when Europe rose like a phoenix from the ashes of destruction. According to this point of view, the conclusion of the war marked not only the end of repression and violence, but also the spiritual, moral, and economic rebirth of the whole continent. The Germans called the months after the war Stunde Null, 0 hour, the implication being that it was a time when the slate was wiped clean, and history allowed to start again. But it does not take much imagination to see that this is a decidedly rosy view of post-war history. To begin with, the war did not simply stop with Hitler's defeat. A conflict on the scale of the Second World War, with all the smaller civil disputes that it encompassed, took months, if not years, to come to a halt, and the end came at different times in different parts of Europe. In Sicily and the south of Italy, for example, it was as good as over in the autumn of 1943. In France, for most civilians, it ended a year later, in the autumn of 1944. In parts of Eastern Europe, by contrast, the violence continued long after VE Day. Tito's troops were still fighting German units in Yugoslavia until at least the 15th of May 1945. Civil wars, which were first ignited by Nazi involvement, continued to rage in Greece, Yugoslavia, and Poland for several years after the main war was over, and in Ukraine and the Baltic states, nationalist partisans continued fighting Soviet troops until well into the 1950s. Some Poles contend that the Second World War did not really end until even more recently, since the conflict officially began with the invasion of their country by both the Nazis and the Soviets. It was not over until the last Soviet tank left the country in 1989. Many in the Baltic countries feel the same way. In 2005, the presidents of Estonia and Lithuania refused to visit Moscow to celebrate the 60th anniversary of VE Day, on the grounds that, for their countries at least, liberation had not arrived until the early 1990s. When one factors in the Cold War, which was effectively a state of perpetual conflict between Eastern and Western Europe, and several national uprisings against Soviet dominance, then the claim that the post-war years were an era of unbroken peace seems hopelessly overstated. Equally dubious is the idea of Stunde Null. There was certainly no wiping of the slate, no matter how hard German statesmen might have wished for one. In the aftermath of the war, waves of vengeance and retribution washed over every sphere of European life. Nations were stripped of territory and assets, governments and institutions underwent purges, and whole communities were terrorized because of what they were perceived to have done during the war. Some of the worst vengeance was meted out on individuals. German civilians all over Europe were beaten, arrested, used as slave labor, or simply murdered. Soldiers and policemen who had collaborated with the Nazis were arrested and tortured. Women who had slept with German soldiers were stripped, shaved, and paraded through the streets covered in tar. German, Hungarian, and Austrian women were raped in their millions. Far from wiping the slate clean, the aftermath of the war merely propagated grievances between communities and between nations, many of which are still alive today. Neither did the end of the war signify the birth of a new era of ethnic harmony in Europe. Indeed, in some parts of Europe, ethnic tensions actually became worse. Jews continued to be victimized, just as they had been during the war itself. Minorities everywhere became political targets once again, and in some areas, this led to atrocities that were just as repugnant as those committed by the Nazis. The aftermath of the war also saw the logical conclusion of all the Nazis' efforts to categorize and segregate different races. Between 1945 and 1947, tens of millions